All right. We're going to continue our talk with the Vietnam War. On Friday, if you weren't here in class, Friday we started talking about the Vietnam War. We talked about the election of President Kennedy in 1960 and how the Vietnam War began to play out. The Vietnam War, again, is going to be called Johnson's War. The Vietnam War is widely associated with President Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. So, just recapping where we left off from the last video that we started watching. After World War II, essentially in a nutshell, France tries to reclaim its colony, which is previously known as French Indochina. French Indochina is never going to be reclaimed by the French. The French lose. They lose a large battle in Vietnam called Dien Bien Phu, and it prompts in 1954 the Geneva Conference. This is where the Geneva Conference, French Indochina, right? So at the Geneva Conference, French Indochina is split into three parts: Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And just like Korea, Vietnam is split into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. This is led by Ho Chi Minh. It's communist. The South is led by a guy, his last name is Diem, D-I-E-M, right? And he's supported by the U.S. They are supposed to have elections supported by the U.S. And this is, again, in 1954, this would be President Eisenhower. This is Eisenhower's first full year in office, second full year in office, and it is very similar to how Korea was the situation that Korea developed. The elections never happen in Vietnam. They're supposed to be having nationwide elections. It doesn't happen, largely because we quickly realized that if the nationwide elections would have happened, it would have been Vietnam would have become communist. So what we wind up doing is we start dumping money upon more and more money. Between 1955 and 1961. So between 1955 and when Kennedy becomes president, Eisenhower has dumped $1 billion, and Congress has dumped $1 billion into South Vietnam. Supporting Diem, Eisenhower sends a few advisors, very small amount of advisors over there to try and advise the South Vietnamese and enact reforms. And this is all part of the domino theory. Eisenhower is not willing to engage in a full-scale war in Vietnam. Remember, Eisenhower is more conservative. He's not trying to spend as much money. And so what you get is in South Vietnam an increasingly hostile and an increasingly deteriorating situation. It ramps up once Kennedy becomes president. So when Kennedy becomes president in 1961, he has a decision to make. What's going to be the involvement in Vietnam? And Kennedy fits this into his policy, which is going to be known as flexible response. We've talked about flexible response. This is Kennedy's idea and his advisors' ideas around him. His Secretary of State, McNamara, his brother, who is Bobby Kennedy, who's his Attorney General, get together and develop this flexible response policy. It's flexible response. And this caters to the Vietnam situation because Kennedy can slowly escalate what's going on in the war and use this flexible response to fit the needs in South Vietnam. So, by 1963, the United States has 16,000 support troops. They are largely not fighting combat roles, but sure, there's probably Americans firing weapons in South Vietnam in the early 1960s. By 1963, again, 16,000 support troops. South Vietnam is deteriorating. The government of Diem is in shambles. And by 1963, in early October, Kennedy himself okays a coup of Diem, the overthrow of Diem's government, and he's assassinated. It's bloody, it's messy, and things are looking increasingly bleak in Vietnam. Just 2 weeks later, John F. Kennedy himself is assassinated in Texas. And so what you have is Lyndon B. Johnson taking over. And we're going to talk more about, what's going on, elsewhere outside of Vietnam. But just for the context of Vietnam, Lyndon B. Johnson takes over, and he increasingly is going to escalate the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. So let's talk about what Lyndon B. Johnson does. Lyndon B. Johnson immediately in 1863 takes over, and he has to start thinking, well, there's a presidential election in 1964. So he has to go on the election, the campaign trail again. And in early 1964, in August, so about mid-1964, there's an incident known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And it's 1964. It's going to do it over here, actually. August of 1964, and it's called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which we talked about on Friday. It's on the other video, but just as a refresher, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin incident leads Congress to basically give Lyndon B. Johnson a blank check for the Vietnam War. He is going to have increasing ability to do what he wants and see what's fit, and they pass what's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gives him authority and the money to pursue his policy as he wants. Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin incident itself is controversial because what claimed to have happened and what actually happened have since become two very different stories. What claimed to have happened is that a North Vietnamese gunboat attacked a U.S. battleship in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of South Vietnam, sort of between the border between South and North Vietnam. Now, it was widely disputed, and recent evidence has come to show that there was really no incident. It doesn't appear there was any wreckage. There were no casualties. The U.S. ship said it came under attack. It returned fire. It's very, very unclear as to if there was any attack whatsoever at all. But nonetheless, President Lyndon B. Johnson, he takes this as an opportunity to say to the public, look, the North Vietnamese are getting aggressive. They're attacking our ships. And he uses this to rally public support, to rally congressional support for him to have this Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed, which gives him an increased power and ability and command of what's going on in Vietnam. So, after 1964, he's reelected in November of 1964. By 1965, there are 185,000 roughly. So by if I said 18, I meant 19. 1965, there are 185,000 U.S. troops. Most would be still in this advisory role, but we do have combat troops in Vietnam by 1965, U.S. troops. And I'm going to put some combat troops. Some combat troops. This begins a process in which there's going to be progressively more and more escalation between 1965 and 1968. Is an escalation, a dramatic escalation of U.S. presence in Vietnam. Your book, or most historians would call this time period between 1965 and into 1968 and 69, as the Americanization period. We are Americanizing the Vietnam War. Before, with Kennedy and with Eisenhower, we were letting the Vietnamese fight their war, and we were in an assistive role. Now, this is going to be an Americanization period in which we are going to be supplying troops, and we are increasingly going to be fighting against the North Vietnamese and what are called the Viet Cong, who are communist sympathizers that live in South Vietnam. This is very similar to what's going on in somewhere like Afghanistan right now, right? So the war in Afghanistan, which began in the 2000s, right? We were fighting an Americanized war there. We were fighting against insurgents and the Taliban, and since then, especially since President Obama's come into office in 2008, he's been scaling back American troops, and we've become now in a more advisory role, right? In Vietnam, it was the reversal. We get advisory role early on, and then we're increasing the American presence and Americanizing the war in Vietnam. This time period, especially by 1968, we're going to talk about an incident. In 1968 onward is when the public really starts slowly losing support for the war. They stop supporting the war. And, by 1968, the election of 1968, people are kind of on the fence. You do have some Americans that are vehemently opposed to the war, but you also have a lot of Americans that are leery. Maybe it is going well. And the media has been portraying things like, yeah, it's going well, and Johnson's been saying publicly, the war is the end is within sight, we're close, if we just get a few more troops, he's still using this whole flexible response policy of Kennedy. And then what happens is in January of 1968, there's something that's called the Tet Offensive. And this is an important event that I think you will probably see on the AP test. It's called the Tet Offensive in 1968. I'm going to erase this up here. And here's what happens. January of 1968. And the Tet Offensive is an offensive attack by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. So it's an attack by the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, and the Viet Cong. And again, the Viet Cong are going to be communist sympathizers who are fighting with the North Vietnamese against U.S. troops and against South Vietnamese soldiers. So, Viet Cong, North Vietnamese Army, fighting on the same side. They are allies against the South Vietnamese Army and American troops, and increasingly more American troops and less South Vietnamese Army troops. And it's an offensive. Now, here's why it's a big deal. This comes on the Tet holiday, which essentially is like New Year's Eve. It's like New Year's, Christmas, and Easter wrapped up into one. It's a major holiday, and there had never been wars. Wars traditionally had not been fought on this Tet holiday. It was seen as a day of downtime. And this offensive happens in January of 1968, and it's televised. There's lots of American reporters. There's TV cameramen on the ground. A guy you might know by the name of Walter Cronkite is going to be front and center in the reporting of this incident. And what happens is the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong attack many cities throughout South Vietnam. This is an attack on American and South Vietnamese held cities in South Vietnam, including the capital Saigon. The American embassy is even besieged. And what happens is initially it's a surprise attack. It throws the South Vietnamese and the Americans catches them off guard. However, this is a military victory for the Americans and the South Vietnamese. Even though it's an offensive launched by the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, they lose. They lose the battle. But they win the media coverage of this event. So they lose the battle, but the media coverage dooms the U.S. And here's why. This is actually one of the greatest military victories for the United States in the Vietnam War. After the initial offense is repelled, the American troops just push back the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. They inflict a large number of casualties, but it doesn't matter. The American public sees this as evidence that Lyndon B. Johnson's been lying this whole time. This war's not in the end to this war is not in sight. Not at all. How could you say the war's end is just around the corner when they're launching a massive offensive attack on the capital city, which is supposed to be the most secure capital city, or the most secure city in Vietnam. I mean, Saigon is in South Vietnam, so I mean, this is evidence to the United States public that things are not going as well as they have been made to believe by the government. It starts this trend of a term that you probably will have to know for the AP test. It's called the credibility gap. Increasingly, we have a credibility gap. And it means, what this credibility gap means is what the government's saying doesn't seem to be very credible to the American public. It's a gap between what the American public believes about the government and what the government's saying. And this is going to cause a lot of tension, a lot of protesting, riots, and things like that are going to break out and spew over into violence at home. So 1968 is a turning point in the Vietnam War. It also ramps up more and more American troops that are going to be there. What happens is, by this time, Johnson is he's had it up to here. He's feeling guilty about how many American lives have been lost at this point. He's stressed because you have all the civil rights things going on and the unrest in the civil rights movement boiling over at home, which we're going to talk more about. And what you wind up having is Johnson has no interest in running for his next term for president in 1968. 1964 to 1968 is a bad time for President Lyndon B. Johnson. So he does not run for president for the presidency in 1968. And when he leaves office, when Johnson leaves office in 1969, as Nixon comes in, there are going to be over 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. So by 1969, when Johnson leaves, there are 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. Nixon is going to come in, and he gets elected, and he is running on this platform, among other things, that he has a solution to get us out of Vietnam. And this solution, there's two words. So Nixon's solution for how to get us out of Vietnam, there's two words you need to know with this. So let me erase this board and write this up here real quick for you guys. Hang in there, we're almost done. So if you're watching, you only got about 5 more minutes. 1968, there's a presidential election. And Nixon becomes president. Remember, Nixon was the vice president under Eisenhower. So, is it under Eisenhower? I don't remember. I got to look that up. So Nixon is elected president in 1968. Nixon's plan, although his plan is very sketchy at best, historians will often joke that his plan was so secretive and so good that he even forgot it. The two things that Nixon proposes is what he calls Vietnamization. Let's give this war back to the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, and start taking back our troops' involvement. Much of what we're doing right now in Afghanistan is this. It's an Afghanization of the war. So this is Vietnamization, and it's what he calls peace with honor. Let's get peace with honor. Let's leave there honorably. And this is a quote directly from him. Peace with honor. Now, this does not mark the end of the war. We're going to still have troops there until the 1970s, the mid-1970s. So I want to be clear about that. But here's what happens. We start withdrawing troops. Money, weapons, and training are going in. So we withdraw troops. Money, weapon, and training is going into the South Vietnamese. Between 1969, we go from 500,000 troops. So in 1969, we have 500,000 troops. And by 1972, we have cut our number of troops down to 30,000. This also marks, it's important to know this also marks the beginning of a communist Vietnam. When we leave Vietnam in 1973 after the Paris Peace Accords are signed, Vietnam, and still to this day, is going to become communist. So, again, 1969, we have all these troops. This is protests are ramping up in the United States. People are going to the streets. Young people, especially those that are young, are going to have this wave of protesting across college campuses, high schoolers. There's significant court cases that we'll go over these in class. A couple of the court cases you need to know. I just want to wrap up here though. 1970 is when you get the protests across college campuses, most notably at Kent State University. 4 students are killed by National Guards at Kent State University. The public is becoming increasingly distressed, and essentially you start having this public outcry. Another event that happens in 1970, which you should know, is the My Lai massacre. I've heard it pronounced both ways, but I think it's the My Lai massacre in 1970. MYLAI, 2 words. Massacre. This is a massacre of over 100 Vietnamese women and children. 100 women and children are massacred by U.S. troops. And actually, a U.S. helicopter flies in and stops what would have been the killing of even more women and children. The lieutenant who was the platoon commander, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, he's going to be put under investigation and charged with war crimes. But no one else, none of the other U.S. soldiers who were involved in this My Lai massacre incident were ever jailed. It causes even more inflammation of the protests and things going on at home. The last part of this note, so the very last thing that I want to have is just the end. We progressively start pulling our troops out, like I said. So by 1972, we have 30,000 troops. And in 1973, the U.S. signs the Paris Accords. The Paris Accords. It's in January. This officially ends the Vietnam War in the United States, although we don't pull our troops out until 1975, the last of the troops, I should say, out until 1975. Here's the final balance sheet. The final balance sheet. $118 billion were spent on the Vietnam War. $118 billion. 58,000 American lives lost. Over about 1.5 million North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese lives were lost. And this war contributes to the end of this American prosperity that we talked about throughout the 1950s and 60s. And the 1970s are going to be marked by inflationary cycles and stagnation, economic stagnation. We're going to talk about this. 1974 is also Watergate, and so Nixon's going to be, he resigns, and Gerald Ford's going to take over in 1974. So, again, this is the Vietnam incident. We're going to talk more about what's going on at home, the civil rights movement, and issues on the domestic front. There's a lot on the table. The 60s are called the stormy 60s for a reason. Between Vietnam, between other Cold War stuff that's flaring up, between the civil rights movements and other social issues that are going to be there in the 60s. All right, hopefully this was helpful, and stop there.